Hey guys! Today I want to teach you how to glaze. I'm going to be painting some glazes on some cups that I have going, so I'm going to show you how to brush on glaze. I recently bisque fired a lot of pots, and so they're ready for glazing. In my classroom, I would teach glazing after the first bisque firing. That usually meant that students had both of their pinch pots and maybe one or two of their coil pots. First, I want to teach you the quick and simple version that's super beginner friendly, and then I want to glaze the second pot with you where we get into tips and tricks and why we do things the way that we do and like how to solve problems that I've seen come up a lot. Okay? All right, to get started, we just need a couple of things. Of course, we need our pot, which is bisqueware, not greenware. We're gonna use a little pencil here. Then we've got our glaze. So I've picked out my glaze. It is a brush on glaze. There is a difference. We'll talk about that later. You need a good brush. I do see a lot of potters online using fan brushes. This drives me absolutely bonkers. You want a really good thick bristle brush. Something like a watercolor brush or a sumi-e brush are gonna be what you really want because they're gonna hold a lot of glaze and make your work easier. And don't forget, we want something to stir the glaze with. I have just a little dowel rod. That works well for me. These bottles are kind of small, so I don't need anything bigger. With a bigger bottle, I might get something like a spatula, but that takes up too much space in here. You don't wanna stir your glaze with your brush because that's gonna wear the brush out faster and get the bristles all mixed up in the glaze, but also because likely your brush is not very tall compared to your bottle of glaze, and then your whole handle will be messy depending on how much glaze is left in your pot. I also have some water here in case I make a mistake and a little sponge. So one of the first things you need to know about glaze is that it contains parts that are glass. So when you fire it, you're basically turning it into molten glass, and then it hardens into that final glossy finish. Now the reason that's important is that in the kiln it is molten. It's not liquid, but it does flow. So you need to make sure that you don't glaze all the way to the bottom, and you definitely don't glaze the foot of your pot. Now, 1/4 of an inch is a good rule of thumb. That's probably gonna be the rule if you're working in a shared space where somebody else is running the kiln or you're using dipping glazes. But I have found that with low fire and mid fire glazes, I can get away with 1/8 of an inch. But you really can't go past that. If you go past 1/8 of an inch, your pot will get stuck to the kiln shelf, okay? Because that glaze does move. I've been glazing long enough now that I can eyeball 1/4 of an inch from the bottom of a pot, but let me show you the trick that I show my students to measure perfectly 1/8 of an inch away from the bottom of the pot without using a ruler. And this is where a pencil comes in. So what you wanna do is take your pencil and lay it down flat on your table and push the lead up to the bottom of your pot like this. And then you can either drag the pencil around, but I actually find it's a little easier to just turn your pot. And then you have a nice line all the way around the bottom of your pot. Now, this doesn't work if you pick up your pencil and tilt it at all. It's gotta be laying flat on your work surface. And it's really important that you use a graphite pencil. Sometimes my students would pick up a colored pencil, but some of the colorants in colored pencils won't burn out in the kiln. And sometimes I would have a student pick up a colored pencil, like a black or a brown, and then they would be left with an orange line going around the bottom of their pot after it was fired. That's not a big deal if your glaze covers it up, but with some glazes that are translucent, or if you didn't perfectly paint up to the line, you might still see it. But let's start glazing. Now, glazing instructions are basically the same no matter the glaze, but bottles of glaze do come with instructions on them. My glaze tells me that it likes to be shaken, not stirred. I still prefer stirring it, and then to apply 3 coats to cone 04 bisqueware, and then fire it to cone 5 or 6. So most glazes are gonna tell you to apply 3 coats. That's what we're doing today. But if you're ever having a really hard time with a glaze, double check those instructions. There might be something like put on 4 coats or only do 2 coats. I've had that happen before. Okay, so I'm gonna open up my glaze here. Now I could shake it, but if you're working in a studio that's shared, sometimes people don't put the lids on all the way. And so that's why I'm just in the habit of stirring. Plus with a stirring stick, I can feel if there's glaze stuck on the bottom or not. Commercial glazes like this are usually pretty easy to stir, are designed to mix up easier and stay mixed longer. So if you're making your own glazes, you might find that the ingredients are more likely to settle to the bottom and take a little bit more mixing. And I definitely wouldn't just shake those. So I'm just feeling and making sure that I've got everything off the bottom. This is really important if your glazes are sitting for a long time between uses. Okay, little trick, set this here. I usually just leave my stirring stick in the jar, but if it bothers you, you can balance it on your lid and then you won't get extra glaze on your work surface. Same with your paintbrush. Now, the first coat is always the most satisfying because we're gonna see all the coverage. So I like to start around the foot here and really get a nice clean line. And since I'm gonna be painting right up to my pencil line, just gonna get my brush here. Now, I want to start a little ways away from the line because the brush is going to spread out, and then I can move towards the line until I just touch it. Because remember, this is 1/8 of an inch away from the bottom, and we definitely can't cross that line. I could stay above the line or eyeball 1/4 of an inch, but I definitely can't go below 1/8 of an inch. Now you'll notice that I'm only doing short strokes here. I'm not trying to spread that glaze out super thin. I think this is one of the mistakes that I see most often. People's glazes don't come out the way they expect because they try to stretch the glaze too much. The glaze needs to go on thick. Okay, there is the bottom outlined. So now I can paint the rest of the side without worrying about that. But another trick I like to do is I like to glaze the inside first so that I can hold on to the outside. So get some more glaze here. And I'll just start at the bottom. And then work my way up the sides, making sure not to leave any bare patches. If you miss a spot, the glaze will not run into it, it will run around it. So if you leave a spot of exposed bisqueware, that won't be covered by the glaze. There's a spot I almost missed. Now around the lip, when you're painting glaze on, it's really important to make sure you get the lip. A lot of my students would just kind of paint up to the lip and forget to actually paint it, and the lip is the part that you want covered in the most glaze. So definitely make sure to paint the lip. Okay, now that the inside's done, I can start on the outside. So I'm gonna show you a trick now, but this trick is gonna be more important on your second and third coats when you can't see the difference between your glaze and your clay. So what I like to do is I like to pick one spot, and I've got the lip of the pot and this ring around the bottom. I'm gonna start with my brush on the ring and pull it up to the top, and then I've got my starting line. Now I'm gonna keep brushing just like that all the way around the pot until I get back to where I started. This gets a little trickier once you need to hold on to this part. The first coat dries pretty fast, so I can hold it here already. And notice I'm only doing 1 or 2 brushes. I'm not trying to make this glaze stretch over the surface because I really want that glaze to come out with the expected effect. All right, and there I am back at the beginning. Now, when you're working on your second and third coat, keeping track of that first line is gonna be more important to make sure you get the right number of coats. And the reason that's so important is because too many coats and your glaze will run, and then your pot and your kiln will have damage to them, and too few coats and the glaze won't come out the way you want. So I'm just gonna wipe a little bit of glaze off my hand. We wanna be careful not to get too much glaze on your hand. This glaze is food safe after it's fired, but before it's fired, having too much glaze on your hands, your skin is porous, it can absorb things, and so you You don't want to overexpose yourself. A little bit's not going to hurt you, but depending on what's in the glaze, it can be dangerous. This one is AP, which means it doesn't have anything dangerous in it. But if it was, what's the other term? But if it has a CL label, it has more, that's a cautionary label. It means there's something in it that could be dangerous if you don't use it correctly. And getting it on your skin is probably incorrect. So once the first layer is dry, we're gonna put on the second coat. I do want the first layer to be completely dry. See this spot right here? It's tacky, it's still a little bit wet. I can tell both because it's glossy and because it's a different color. It's darker than the rest of the glaze. So that first coat usually dries really fast, and then the second and third coats will take a little bit longer because the bisque is absorbing some of that water. And that's part of how the glaze is bonded to it. So if I start to paint over this spot where it's still glossy, I could end up pulling that glaze off of the bisque instead of adding a second layer, and that's why we want to wait for everything to be completely dry. The inside is completely dry, so I'm going to go ahead and start my second coat there. Now, glazes are what's called a suspension. That means nothing is dissolved in the water. We just have particles suspended in the water by stirring it. So like if you mix sugar in your drink, the sugar dissolves and now it's part of the water and it won't settle out. That's not the case with what goes into glazes. The ingredients can settle, and that's why it is important to stir your glaze occasionally, especially if you're glazing for a long time. The rule of thumb that I would tell my students is stir once between every layer. Now that is overkill, especially for a commercial glaze, which isn't gonna settle as fast. But that made sure that my students at least remembered occasionally. And that helped make sure that my students' work came out the way they expected. Because if you forget to stir it and it settles too much, or you walk away for a while and it settles, then everything that makes the glaze colored and pretty will have sunk to the bottom, and then you're basically just painting it with dirty water, and you're not gonna get the effect that you want. Okay, now on my second coat, I like to change the direction that I'm putting the glaze on. So instead of moving my brush side to side, I'm brushing from the bottom up, doing vertical strokes. I have found that with some glazes, you can see the direction of your brush strokes on the finished pot if you're not careful. This is especially true if you don't put the glaze on thick enough, or if the glaze is especially translucent and the pot is smooth. So a textured pot is gonna hide brush strokes, but a smooth pot is more likely to show them. I don't think this glaze that I'm using today is gonna be a problem, but it's just a habit that I'm in, so I just do it. Now, I already did vertical brush strokes on the outside, so I'm gonna do horizontal the second time. But I wanna start by going around my foot. On the outside, I always start by going around the foot to make sure I keep that line nice and clean. Oops, and there I went over. But that's great because now I can show you what to do if that happens. I also have a little bit here that went over. Okay, and then I'm just gonna keep going from there all the way to the lip. Now, if you're noticing that it feels like the second coat is taking longer to dry, it is. Because the bisque has already absorbed the water from the first coat. The second coat is gonna take longer to dry. And then once I'm far enough away from the foot, I can put the pot down and finish glazing it while it sits on my table. And then I just really want to double check, make sure that I glaze the lip. You definitely don't want a dry spot on the lip of your pot. especially if it's a cup, something you want to drink out of or eat off of, and because it's the top of the pot, it's like the first thing you see. And now we get to watch paint dry. So like I said, you want to make sure that the glaze is fully dry before you paint the next coat, because you don't want that semi-dry tacky glaze to get stuck to your brush and pulled off instead of applying the new layer of glaze. So it's got to be fully dry before we do the third coat. Now, while we're waiting, you could have a second pot that you're starting to glaze, and it will be easy if you're just glazing them all the same color. But if you're wanting to use multiple glazes, you just want to make sure that you don't lose track of what color you're putting on which pot. So if you get distracted easily or kind of lose your place, I would recommend sticking to one color or maybe just working on one pot at a time. But I often glaze multiple pots, multiple colors, all at the same time, and I'll show you how I keep track of all that here in a minute. Okay, the inside of this is looking pretty good. I can still see, like, where it's darker, there is still some water, but it's not shiny anymore, so it's okay for me to go ahead and start on that final coat. Every time you come back to your glaze after it's been sitting for a minute, you need to stir it. And again, really make sure that you get the lip of your pot. And then there's some little drips in here. Now, some potters don't like the way it looks if there's a little drip, especially low fire and mid fire glazes don't move a lot, and so that drip might be exactly where you see it now. If that bothers you, just smooth it out with your brush while it's still wet. But a drip can also look really cool. It can be a feature. So like, this pot has some really beautiful drips. But this is also high fire glaze, which moves a lot, so it didn't look like this before it was fired. Okay, let's go ahead and glaze around our foot. And after this last coat, I'll show you how to clean up that foot so that it's not glazed past our 1/8 of an inch mark. Notice how I'm still putting that glaze on nice and thick. I'm not trying to stretch it. And for this third coat, I realized I'm not really paying attention to which direction my brush strokes are going. But this is not a translucent glaze. It's one that does interesting things. And this is the third coat, so I've already gone 2 directions. So the third one would just be either 2 vertical or 2 horizontal. Once that's dry, we'll clean up the foot. Okay, now that this is dry enough for me to handle it, it's still got some like dark spots, which just means the glaze hasn't dried all the way yet. And the inside has some glossy bits. That's gonna happen on the inside because there's not as much air movement around it. But I can go ahead and show you how to clean up the foot. So we just need a little bit of water and a little sponge. So what I'm gonna do here is I've got this set up to where now I can gently wipe it with my sponge. So I'm just gonna get my sponge a little wet. And then I just wanna do a horizontal swipe. And I'm really controlling where the edge of that sponge touches the pot. And notice I'm not going fast because slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? And that makes sure I don't get outside my lines or take off more than I meant to. If you do this before your glaze is all the way dry, if your glaze is a little wet or tacky, you're gonna accidentally take off more than you mean to. Now I'm not gonna set this down on the lip because the lip is gonna be the most delicate part. It's gonna be the easiest to chip glaze off the lip or smudge it or dent it. And we definitely wanna keep the lip looking good all the way through firing. So I'm just gonna rotate that and go around here Now remember, because we took this all the way down to 1/8 of an inch, I absolutely have to make sure that there are no drips beyond that, because the glaze is going to move while it's firing, and it may drip down below that line. So that's why we cannot let the glaze go below the line before it's fired. And I'm just drying my hand off before I rotate the pot, because if my fingers are wet and I get that glaze wet again, I may pull some of it off. So it's a really good idea to have a towel nearby so you can dry your fingers if you're needing to do this. Or I'm just drying my fingers on my apron. The last check you want to do is get down here at eye level with the foot, and you want to rotate it around and make sure that no glaze is touching your surface. See, we've got an even little bit of clay all the way around. And now I'm going to show you a little bonus thing you can do to really make your signature stand out. But if you're in a classroom, definitely make sure this is okay with your teacher before you do it. I can do this because the foot of my pot is indented. I have a foot ring here and my signature is in the middle of that foot ring. You can't do this if the bottom of your pot is flat across. So some people might want to paint the whole inside. That's not what I want to do here. I like to make the foot of my pot 1/4 of an inch tall, which means that the glaze on the bottom of my foot could drip and stick to the shelf in my kiln. But to make my signature pop and look really good in photographs, I'm just gonna put a little bit of glaze in here. You don't wanna use a lot because you're gonna wipe back most of it. And I just wanna make sure that I got glaze into each of these spots. I usually just like to do this with the glaze that's left over in the brush. And then once that glaze is dry, I can wipe it back with a sponge. So we'll let that dry real quick. Okay, now I've gotten my sponge just a little damp, squeezed all the extra water out of it. And I'm just gonna swipe over this. And you don't wanna spend too much time sitting on it. You wanna really swipe. And sometimes a twist is okay. And I'm just swiping, and then I'm rotating to a clean part of the sponge and doing it again. You don't want to scrub too hard because then you can pull the glaze out of your signature, and we're just trying to take it off the surrounding surface. Oops, I pulled it all the way out of the 6. Here we go. Okay, and that just makes my signature really easy to read after it's fired. Okay, now that you know the basics of glazing, I want to get into some more like tips and tricks, how to glaze more complicated pots, and how to glaze if you want to use more than one color. But this video is probably already getting long enough, and I'm expecting some new glazes in the mail in the next couple of days, so I'm really excited to try those out. So I'm gonna wait until I get those, and then I'll make a part 2 to this video where I get more into the details and the complicated parts of glazing. All right, see you next time. So I have enough experience now that I usually just eyeball? Glazes are what's called a suspensions? I'm expecting a couple of glazes in the mail soon, and I'm really excited to test them out. So I'm gonna wait till I get those, and then I'm gonna make a tart, yes, a fruit tart.